Hello, everybody. My name is Bronwyn Barry, and I am pleased to be the host and moderator for this particular session. The session is titled Codes We Want, and I'm joined today by two other practitioners. Mike Fowler joins us from the Pacific Northwest, and he will share his experience and activity in integrating codes and working to advocate for codes and policy. He works at Methuen Architects up in Seattle. Our other presenter today is Shefali H.Sanghvi. Shefali joins us from New York City and is the sustainability lead at Datner Architects. And she will also share a case study looking at how codes really drive high performance design and how we want to help support that moving forward. I will close the presentation session with the background on the Passive House Network's work on helping to support codes that we want. And then we will lead into a moderated discussion about how we can collectively move things forward. So with that, I will hand it over to Mike to start sharing his contribution. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bronwyn. And thank you all for joining this session, The Codes We Want. I feel we're all probably thinking a similar thought, have similar questions here today, that we want great codes and standards, and Passive House is certainly one of those standards. But we feel that our codes and regulations don't support Passive House strong enough. So why don't we have the codes we want, and how do we get the codes that we want? And our code landscape includes many different codes. There's the International Energy Conservation Code, the IECC. ASHRAE is another big code in our realm. Plus, there's also a lot of local codes that many of us work under. New York City has Local Law 97. California Title 24, Zero Energy Ready Oregon, the Massachusetts Stretch Code, and British Columbia Energy Step Code are just a few examples. And while the IECC and ASHRAE promote themselves as a national code, there are many variations across the country on what code has been adopted. And on this map of the IECC Residential Energy Code status, there are 8 codes that have no statewide energy code. There are another 3 using a version that is older than 2009. And there are 22 states where 2009 is the latest version that has been adopted. That makes 25 states where the residential energy code is at least a full decade and 4 code cycles behind. And as of June of this year, there's only 5 states that have adopted the most recent 2021 IECC. So everywhere else, that makes 45 states that are lagging behind what would be viewed as our potential national energy code to varying degrees. And just a quick side note to point out that the data in this chart, which is from March of this year, focuses on each state and the percent efficient difference between the state code and the 2021 IECC. But this chart does not factor in locations such as the state of Massachusetts with its stretch code, where individual locations and jurisdictions have the ability to adopt a more stringent code. So what this chart is showing is the Massachusetts base code and not the stretch code. And it's very similar with the commercial energy code comparison to ASHRAE 2019. Again, there's another 8 states that don't believe in having a statewide energy code. There are 12 that are at least 3 code cycles and nearly a decade behind. But there's a little bit more. There's 8 states on the commercial side that have adopted at least the equivalent or better of ASHRAE 2019. And in the commercial codes, included in those 8 states without an energy code, there are 6 that are at least allow local jurisdictions to adopt some of their own home rules. New to this code mix is building performance standards that local jurisdictions and states are starting to implement on existing buildings, setting limits on energy use or carbon emissions. And what this makes is for a patchwork of codes. And a patchwork can be very cute if you're drawing a dog. But for building and energy codes, a patchwork of codes is not useful or helpful to us. What we end up with is a full spectrum, A to Z, of codes ranging from locations that have no state energy code and places that have higher performance codes. In locations where there's no state energy code, the hurdle to overcome when we talk about passive house is very high. And some of the typical responses are, passive house is going to cost way too much, therefore it's just cost prohibitive, or simply that building to passive house standard is way too hard and it can't be done. There's another fear perception about blower door air tightness when these tests are not required by jurisdictions. They ask, why would we ever want to try for that? And even if we did try, and we probably won't make it, and therefore what's the penalty that's going to be imposed on us? And we contrast that with locations that have higher performing codes. And speaking from a perspective of our office doing a lot of work in California and Washington State, is that comments I hear often is the energy code is already hard enough to meet. So why should we take on even more effort, cost, risks to try to get a certification such as passive house? And there's a perception that even at these higher performing codes, the passive house is still significantly harder than what our codes are, when in reality, it's not that big of a difference. The gap distance has shrunk, and it's not that big as what is perceived. And a good example is that we do have blower door testing as a requirement here in our state. And we did have one of our multifamily projects, which was not even trying for passive house. It wasn't even part of the program at all. They were just simply looking to be 0.15 CFM, 75 pascals, air tightness test in order to have a little cushion over the state 0.17 maximum. And their final blower door test came back at a 0.074 CFM 75 pascals, which exceeds the FIA standard of 0.08. And in a building that size would also be under the 0.6 ACH 50 that Passive House Institute calls for. And this isn't a project that didn't even try to have passive house air tightness levels, and they did this. And I think this is really showing the power of what codes can do in terms of pushing the industry in practice. And so for the codes that we want, how do we change it? And here I'm going to share a little bit about my work and efforts in the state of Washington as part of the Energy Code Technical Advisory Group. And since the 2015 code cycle, and on behalf of AI Washington, I represent all architects in the state with a voice and a vote to approve, to modify, or to approve or to not approve proposals to change our state energy code. And the Technical Advisory Group is the first gate or hurdle in our code process that proposals need to clear. And that's followed by the State Code Council Subcommittee, and then finally the full State Code Council vote. The list here, except for one, are all proposals that I generated and wrote the code language for. And then with some support from some key friends, some key peer reviewers who publicly supported these proposals, was able to get them approved into code. I'll note that the very first code cycle change that I tried to propose something in was back in 2012, and that was not approved. In 2015, I had a successful proposal pass the city of Seattle for changing the maximum air tightness test for commercial construction from 0.40 CFM 75 down to 0.25. But after going through some public comment, the city staff increased it up to 0.30, and they did a similar increase on the option credit. So after having a little taste of success in 2018 code cycle, I proposed the same change that was now part of the city of Seattle as for the entire state of Washington, and just did a little upgrade to make the option credit a little bit lower at 0.17 for the air tightness test. And that same code cycle, I proposed a balanced heat recovery for multifamily construction at minimum 60% efficiency and then an option credit level at 80%. And both of these proposals passed. And what this did, it created a new code minimum option path that included air tightness, heat recovery ventilation, and enhanced building enclosure with better building insulation, wall insulation, and windows. And then when I modeled that combination in the PHPP using the Department of Energy prototype building sizes for multifamily, what I learned is that combination would meet the PHI low energy building standard for space heating and for air tightness. And just a quick side note that right below that, the residential energy code that we also have passive house listed as an alternate in our energy code as a compliance pathway. And this is where you can show design approval from a Passive House certifier, and that is the only thing needed for energy code compliance in the state if you choose that path. I didn't propose that particular change. That was done by others, but I'll say as a technical advisory group voter, it was a pleasure to vote in favor of a Passive House proposal such as that. And to borrow a line from the musical Hamilton, it's important to be in the room where it happens, to be where these decisions are being made and have a voice in that. And just one other side note, that 2018 was a very good code year for me in terms of code proposals. I also created the Appendix F in our state commercial energy code, which gives local jurisdictions the ability to adopt a minimum energy budget for different project use types, and then letting the energy meter prove compliance with the energy code. And that was the proposal I first started with in 2012, which did not pass. But 2 cycles later, I was successful in getting it through. In the most recent code cycle, 2021, I was able to add another option credit level for Passive House air tightness. And then I also, in 2021, did a proposal to change our state mechanical code to require MERV 13 filtration for all public occupancy spaces, which are offices, multifamily buildings, any place where the public might be. And the point of this list is to show that changing our codes towards the codes we want is absolutely possible. And just a quick note before I leave this slide, to make one more point of emphasis, it's important how we frame and communicate our code desires. And I'm going to use an example, and give credit to Bronwyn because she's the first one that I saw post this term online, and that is wildfire smoke tightness. And I think that's a very powerful term and phrase that communicates a benefit of building air tightness in a way that's very easy to understand and comprehend without us falling into the technical small number weeds and speaking Pascal to the public. And you might remember that this summer, those of you from Chicago all the way to the Northeast, you received your own climate crisis smoke signal this summer. I mean, look at this. I mean, those of us in the West know how horrible this is. But Passive House now is a very important, compelling message that we can share about how Passive House can protect health by providing a smoke-tight enclosure and providing filtered ventilation air. So I want to do a quick share on how 2 of our Passive House projects have met code. And the first one is the Bush School in Seattle. To our knowledge, it's the first Passive House school in the state of Washington and the largest west of the Mississippi River. In addition to Passive House, it's Salmon Safe certified, which is a local standard for stormwater runoff quality. It's also seeking zero energy certification, which eventually it will achieve. But in terms of permitting the energy code, we had no issues or concern meeting that because we just said, we'll meet the prescriptive because Passive House meets and exceeds that. Just easy, check the box, done. I'd say the only design parameter we would change now if we were starting this project today was we would design it to deliver a little bit more of outdoor ventilation air at 5 air changes per hour to the classrooms instead of the design 4. And that's just a learned lesson we feel from COVID. We were providing above code ventilation, but the newer standards now, our recommendations are to provide more ventilation air to our indoor classroom spaces. And for this project, the energy code wasn't a problem. Our permitting challenge were the site constraints of being next to a 100-year-old historic building on the left, the proximity of nearby significant trees that had to remain. We were steep slope restricted on essentially 3 sides of this building. And then we had to really go through a lot of public meetings about putting a lower level entry on the other side of this image, which fronts onto the historic Frederick Law Olmsted Gateway. And our other project that's Passive House is the Princeton University Meadows Graduate Student Housing, which is currently under construction. And when this started construction, these 3 buildings combined at that time were the 6th largest Passive House project in the U.S. And as you might expect, again, we had no problems meeting the state energy code for New Jersey. The hardest part for me was just learning how to do CompCheck online. Our Project UA building enclosure beat the minimum energy code by 30%. It was far more difficult to meet Passive House. And in particular for this project, we have a room full of clothes dryers. And getting that to work was the most technical, challenging part of our project. But the quick point here is that these examples are of Passive House projects. Passive House projects are going to exceed most current codes easily. And yes, we can do passive house projects one at a time, but is that going to have the large scale impact that we want? And we need to make it, if we want to make a difference to reduce the gap between code minimum passive house and pushing codes to near passive house levels, or ways to require passive house as our codes. That's where we think we really need to start making our push. And I think an interesting challenge, what I'm going to just I got 3 more slides just to touch on passive survivability. And this is for a project that we were doing in the California Bay Area. And this is modeling that we've done after last year's September 2022's heat wave. And essentially this is showing that on the lower part, if you keep your windows open at night during a typical week, you can keep the space comfortable. But if you needed to keep those windows closed, say for wildfire smoke, for noise, or for whatever, there's an overheating problem that happens even with code compliant buildings. And then during the heat wave, even if you're able to, by opening your windows, it's 104 outside, which is 40 C for Celsius. We get into some uncomfortable temperatures the heat index inside climbing above 80, and then there's 3 days where it touches into the 90s. But if we studied this to build it to passive house, and providing that, and this is a case where we provided exterior shading, a little bit better envelope, and this is on a west-facing unit, the hottest unit, and shading that the best we can, that even during the heat wave, there's enough cooling at night in a drier climate, such as the West Coast, where we can keep the index under 80 degrees, even when the temperature outside is 104. And this is a good scenario to look at because this is what happens if the power goes out. We would be able to keep people comfortable. The upper red line, say if this happened during a wildfire smoke event and you didn't want to open your windows at night, that using filtered outdoor air, the temperatures do climb into the 80s, which is a little bit uncomfortable, and it's in that caution range from the National Weather Service. But these are manageable temperatures for passive survivability. And with that, I'm going to end it there because I want to pass it over to Shefali. I want to thank you for this opportunity to share some of the code advancements that have been happening in the Northwest. And now, please, Shefali, take it away.
So thanks, Mike, and I thank you everyone for joining us today. I just wanted to take a moment to talk through New York City and some of our city and state policies that sort of lead us to passive house. As said, I am Shefali H.Sanghvi, and I am the Director of Sustainability and a Senior Associate in the Housing Studio at Dattner Architects. Dattner was founded in 1964 with a focus on civic work, which we define as affordable housing, transit and infrastructure projects, healthcare, educational, cultural, institutional projects. And through all of this, sustainability has always sort of been emphasized and at the forefront of all of our work. The idea being that you really couldn't talk about designing within the civic realm without really emphasizing sustainability for the benefit of not only the people who own and operate the buildings, but also the people who use and live in those buildings. In 2012, a few of our staff members created a volunteer sustainable practice group to start talking about the things that matter to us from a climate point of view. And really the initial focus was really on energy performance. How do we tackle energy performance and make sure our projects are performing the best way possible? And now we are a group that is approximately 70 members that we meet to discuss climate issues and do a significant amount of research that impacts all of our work. The photo on this slide is 425 Grand Concourse, a recently completed passive house project that is one of the largest projects in North America. And it's an all affordable project with 277 units. It's really gone a long way in setting ourselves up as sort of urban passive house experts, especially in New York City. So we are very lucky that the bulk of our work is in New York City because New York recognizes the imperative to address the impact of the built environment on the climate and longstanding environmental justice issues. So just as a way of background, I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about what's gotten us to this point and where policies are and how close we can get to passive house, really sort of echoing Mike's statement about this really becoming an incremental increase as opposed to this insurmountable sort of off-screen increase, right? That it's so big that it's not even worth thinking about. So in 2007, New York City issued Plan NYC, a strategic plan that set ambitious climate targets and provided a framework where we a series of laws and action items could be implemented for all the work in the city. These initiatives really require interagency coordination and allows New York City to position itself as one of the leaders of what can be done at the city or municipality level to address operational carbon reduction. And then in 2012, New York City was really hard hit by Hurricane Sandy and realized that the issue was not sort of like flooding from Hurricane Sandy, but storm surge. And resiliency became a big part of our citywide sustainability efforts. And then as time passed, we realized that resiliency needed to include extreme heat, viral conditions such as COVID, and smoke, as those very apocalyptic pictures that Mike showed. So this is just a really helpful graphic to show the work that the city has done since 2007 to bring us to where we are today. This was included as part of the most recent version of the Plan NYC report that was issued this year called Getting Sustainability Done. There we go. This slide has a lot of text, but I just wanted to highlight some of the major policy initiatives that made it easier for us to begin to have very meaningful conversations with clients about designing passive house buildings, and to really make these all feel like manageable, incremental changes that work within a construction practice that everyone is familiar with. And rather than sort of saying like everything is new and you have to do this new thing right now. So the Zone Green initiatives passed in 2012 allowed us to have a conversation with clients that to talk about how we could insulate our exterior walls without impacting their bottom line, which is rent and the size of the spaces behind the exterior wall. The 80/50 plan released in 2014 set the stage for buildings in New York City to reduce their carbon emissions by 80% in 2050 with an interim target of 40% reductions by 2030. And all of these are measured against a 2005 baseline. In 2019, New York State released climate legislation, the cornerstone of which is like as part of this Climate Act, the big push is for the state utility to clean their grid by 2040, which really starts eliminating some of these discussions of like, oh, you're shifting to all electrification, but our grid is so dirty. So what's really the cost of going to all electric buildings? In 2019, New York City released a series of laws under the Climate Mobilization Act umbrella, and Local Law 97, which Mike mentioned earlier, set a series of carbon emission targets with rates set for each sort of energy use, and buildings are penalized if they surpass the emission targets for their specific typology and whatever year you are in this goal. In 2021, New York City passed Local Law 154, which is an all electrification bill. And earlier this year, through a budget line item, New York State followed suit. And this is all very significant because historically in New York City, especially, gas has been significantly cheaper than electricity. And so it's been really difficult to have these conversations with people who provide affordable housing to say like, oh, we have to shift to this all electric model, because very reasonably so, the question is not only how are we supposed to afford this as operators of this building, but how are our tenants supposed to afford like a cooling bill? So all of this legislation really sort of by pushing that all buildings basically have to be all new buildings have to be electric by the end of 2027 takes gas out of the discussion. We are now talking about a completely new baseline. So what does, if I could get this to work. Yes, all right. So what does this mean for passive house buildings in New York? So I wanted to use this building as a case study to sort of talk through the impact of all of this work. So Vital Brookdale is a project our office worked on as part of New York State's Vital Brooklyn initiative. And this was a state initiative that really emphasized providing healthy, affordable housing with a large sort of wellness community-facing portion. This particular project we started design in early 2019, and our client was a for-profit development team. So So even though the climate mobilization hadn't passed when we started design, we knew that it was coming. So we were able to use that as a jumping off point to have that discussion with the client that, you're going to be penalized for carbon emissions. So we had worked with our sustainability consultant to have them do a local law 97 analysis so that we could say okay, if you go with a typical gas boiler and hydronic baseboard, this is what our penalty will be by 2035. And then if we go to an all-electric system, this is where we'll be. And then we also were able to use the state's emphasis on health and wellness to really convince the client that there was more than just operational benefits and, avoiding local law 97 compliance issues, but also this is in keeping with the real intent of this initiative. And so Bright Power, who was our sustainability consultant, provided not only the local law 97 analysis, but also first cost and operational cost analysis for ERVs and VRF split systems for heating and cooling, as opposed to the more typical model at the time, which was hydronic baseboards and sort of through wall ACs that may or may not be provided by the owner. And then at the same time, the client worked with the state agency to see how moving to an all electric heating and cooling system would impact utility allowances and potential rent in the building. Because in 2019, this felt a little bit like a pipe dream. So as you can see on these sort of plans that we have on the right, the site has a very unique geometry, which really resulted in a 2-building scheme with a shared lobby. And contrary to what we think about as New York City construction, and you can sort of see it in some of those overall images that Mike had shared, not only of New York, but also Seattle, this is a very horizontal building where the site is very spread out. It's not this compact footprint that goes up. And that resulted in challenges, not only challenges for just typical architectural challenges of how do we make this seem as one cohesive project and how do we build this within what we typically see as construction practices in New York City, but we had this really unique surface area to volume ratio that needed to be addressed from a passive house standpoint to talk about the impact of all of this to the building envelope and therefore our energy consumption. And we really got to the point where it no longer made sense to insulate the exterior walls. We had to start thinking about how we were insulating our horizontal surfaces. So this project has an R70 roof insulation, which still to me feels like so much insulation. It's more than double what code requires as a minimum. And then we also had to review the amount of glazing that we provided and had to find this balance between energy performance, aesthetics, because we are all architects and this matters to us. This is what we do. And also the quality of life of the residents in the building. Yeah. Ultimately, though, we were able to leverage the indoor air quality benefits of Passive House to select healthier materials for the material that we were using in the building. The idea being that we're building this very tight building. We're controlling all of the ventilation. So let's not fill it full of plastic that is just going to off gas and, impact resident health. And we were able to provide, because of the very unique site geometry, access to both a significant amount of indoor and outdoor recreation space, and all of it has access to natural light. So this project started construction in April 2020, so right really at the beginning of COVID, and it was really interesting to see how just by virtue of building a Passive House building, we were addressing many of the COVID concerns, right? Like how are we ventilating these spaces? How are we making sure that things are unitized? And then, just indoor air quality. And then earlier this year, when we had the wildfire smoke from Canada, which is something that in New York City, we never thought that we would have to deal with. It seemed like such a West Coast problem, not an East Coast problem. We were really able to see firsthand about how Passive House projects were really well suited to be future-proof and be truly resilient. And so ultimately, as great as Vital Brookdale is, and I realize that I am not an unbiased person to tell that story, the reality is that this project could not be built today. It has, and that ultimately it's a great thing. It's a great thing that the landscape has shifted so much in the last 4 years that this building is already out of date in spite of being a passive house building. The reason being that this project has a gas-fired hot water plant and it has gas dryers. Mike sort of alluded to the complication of having a room full of gas dryers. For us, we solved that by putting that building outside of our passive house envelope and just carving it out. And, I also wanted to take a moment to talk about specifically for affordable housing, the role that city and state agencies play. And it's not really code, it's something extra, right? That if you want to have the benefit of whatever funding opportunities they provide or whatever like low interest construction loans that they can provide, you have to meet their requirements. So I think they're really doing a great job in bridging that gap between where code is leaving us and where passive house is. So at the city level, we're anticipating, the city's HPD is going to issue standards hopefully soon in the next month or so. And we're anticipating that it's going to have significantly more stringent sustainability standards, including requiring mechanical ventilation. And then if you're designing something that could be passive house certified, that you will have to provide ERVs that really sort of take away a lot of this discussion of like, oh, passive house is just, it's going to cost that much more. It's like, well, you're already doing all of those things. So what we're really talking about is the soft cost that is associated with doing the modeling, the third-party inspections, and actually going for the certification. At the state level, HCR sustainability guidelines provide a 3-tiered pathway for compliance, and their application process is very competitive because all affordable housing in the state can apply for funding from the agency. So their whole system is set up that the more REACH goals you meet, the more competitive your application is. So passive house is one of the REACH goals that allows you to bypass completely one of their tiers and have a very sort of competitive application. And I think that's it. So I just want to say thank you for letting me have this moment to talk through some of the work that we're doing in New York City and obviously with the state. And I really wanted to share this image because it really highlights how complicated the geometry is. It gives us, you can see we have this 100 kilowatt our solar array to help offset some of our energy demand. And you can see that the roof on the other building is covered with extensive green roof trays. And this is also part of the Climate Mobilization Act. Local Law 9294 said that all roof area that isn't required for mechanical equipment needs to either have a green roof or a solar array. So that also sort of like starts pushing it closer and closer to like, you're already setting the stage. What is the difference between doing this and doing this? And I think that that's really sort of, it doesn't get us to where we want to be, which is that all projects are passive house certified, but it really gets us very close. And I also like this picture because it really sort of is like a peek behind the curtain of all of the mechanical equipment that is required to make our buildings work the way that they do. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bronwyn.
Thank you, Shefali. Really fascinating to learn about how raising the floor helps make the ceiling not so high. So I'm going to segue from the two previous presentations into a little bit of background about what the Passive House Network has been doing with regards to helping support and push for the codes we want. And just share a little bit about what we have been doing and what we will be doing and what's coming next. For many of you who've been attending these events and participating in a bunch of Passive House Network activities, you will have heard that we really took a deep dive into supporting policymakers and codes. And we mapped out a journey for ourselves, which I'm not going to go too deeply in here, but I wanted to give you a little bit of background. We really said, okay, we need to do this properly. We need to really research into what codes are working, where they're in place, and why they're working. And then use that research and that background to inform the direction we want to go, and develop a bunch of resources for our membership and our broader community. So that's exactly what we've been doing, and we're at the end of that really fantastic journey that has been incredibly illuminating, sometimes challenging, of course, and developing a lot of these resources now to share with our members, so that practitioners all across the state in the various jurisdictions, as Mike outlined, which are all in different places, will have the ammunition that they need to be able to come and ask for the right things. So some of the stuff that we have already developed and delivered, very early in 2019, we put out our first policy resource guide, looking at various programs and policies that were being implemented at the time, and just sort of very tentative early review of what they were doing. We then followed that up in 2021 with a report on is cost the barrier performance, because over and over again that gets used as an excuse to say, no, we shouldn't do it, or we shouldn't incentivize it because it's too expensive. And we've debunked that myth, and those costs keep coming down further and further. Then in 2022, that's when we published the findings of an extensive 2-year investigation into where policies were in place and which ones were working. That was part of an ACEEE paper. It was published as Policy On-Ramps Using Passive House to Drive Decarbonization. And we published it on our Passive House Network website as this Policy That Works report. And that's really served as the foundation for all the other stuff that we are working on, and the programs that we are really actively now focusing on supporting. And I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but I'll just cover a couple of the key findings from that. We saw that policy really works as an ecosystem. Let me finish that. And that where passive house buildings were thriving and flourishing and accelerating, this full ecosystem of programs were in place. They started out with very clear targets. So just publishing, policymakers, please give us the end goal. Nobody doesn't like to know where they're eventually going. If you use Google Maps and you say, well, I sort of want to go somewhere around there. Nobody ever does that. We all want to know what the end destination is. And that was very apparent in the policies that were working. We also saw that training, workforce training development was key. Having a critical mass of well-trained practitioners in a region was essential to move high-performance passive house buildings forward. And we saw that project incentives, and those we found in a bunch of different, a variety of forms, were also in place to make just bridging that gap for developers to be that much easier, a little more carrot to make taking the leap less scary. So those were 3 of the very key things. And then we found really interesting patterns common to a lot of these programs and policies, which I think were really fascinating. As an architect, we are very visual people. We like patterns. Patterns sort of make a lot of sense. And to see this occurring, this phenomenon occurring in policy and programs was really fascinating to identify. And we saw these as steps, cross hatches, cross connectors, and circular feedback loops, which, again, going back to the sort of ecological integrated ecosystem narrative, utilizing those patterns made a lot of sense. And it's small wonder that those are the ones that are successful. I'm not going to go into all of the other stuff, but we did find very important was the incrementalist approaches were not as successful as the backcasting approaches. And this goes back to us identifying key to know what the end goal is. So if the target is identified first and then the steps are developed by backcasting rather than the incremental process that we currently use to move our code forward, that was a much more successful structure. And then lastly, we also found a really interesting opportunity where elements outside of our energy code could be leveraged to move high performance buildings forward. So we saw places where zoning was really a great lever that isn't typically looked at as something that creates beneficial energy or performance or greenhouse gas emissions outcomes. But really, again, going back to this notion of vertically integrated, holistically connected programs and policies, really those were the things that bubbled up from our research in that deep dive report. So the latest resources that we have either just released or about to release are also building on what we have found in the Policy That Works report. I'm super pleased that this report that has just been published called Safe at Home is gaining incredible amount of traction and generating a massive amount of interest, a resurgence in interest in Passive House. This report, which we were fortunate enough to have funded through an Energy Foundation grant, has been impressively, surprising us really about how much traction it's getting and how many media outlets are writing articles that connect back to this report and are referencing information that we put together in it. Really focusing specifically on all electric multifamily passive house buildings and how they can really drive and support our decarbonization efforts and policies. Building on that, we have extracted the policies that we want, the very specific ones, and we are just about to release this additional resource guide that really maps out the process that we have seen to be the most successful, so that our practitioners can take this and say, here, this is what we really want. And we've seen there are really 4 basic steps, starting with really foundational barrier removal. We've seen that an implementation or establishing of an alternate passive house compliance pathway is one of the foundational key moves that needs to be put in place first to allow the practitioners to not have to do 2 models. Typically, there's a baseline code model that everybody has to do, and then there's a passive house model. The 2 model pathway really is, psychologically more of a roadblock than often financially. But on bigger projects, it is a financial barrier, and we don't need to have to do extra work to do better. So that is something we saw really working well in the regions where passive house is scaling rapidly. And I might add, though, that in and of itself isn't enough to drive a market. The second step, which is establishing incentive programs and projects for projects and professional training, is the next essential step to really accelerate the adoption and the implementation of passive house. It's not enough to only do the ultimate compliance pathway. The incentive programs are the sweeteners As Shefali mentioned, cities are really key players in being able to start with these, and they can take multiple forms like zoning or setting benchmark minimum requirements, setting stretch and reach codes for what cities wants to happen in their region, and making passive house the visible option to push project developers and support architects who really do want to do this, to say, hey, yes, we will make this faster, easier, cheaper for you. And then the third step is the implementation of those reach codes or step codes. We're seeing this working already incredibly effectively in Massachusetts, who did the first and the second steps already. Massachusetts opt-in reach code is just doing phenomenal things. We're incredibly supportive of that effort. And then step 4, we see this coming down the pike in places like Massachusetts, because they've done the preparation work to get their market and the professional community up to speed and very comfortable with delivering passive house. And that's when you just transform your baseline code to meet passive house. As Mike mentioned, it's not that big of a leap anymore from where we are currently. So going there is not that big of a deal anymore. Another resource that we will be putting out really shortly is this electrification and PER document, really looking at how the Passive House Institute's PER framework is the PHI's version of climate-specific standards, and how it does a really interesting and innovative. It's an innovative way to support electrification without having to ban gas, because we see a lot of jurisdictions getting a lot of pushback from the gas bans, and we want to be able to provide a mechanism for them to say, hey, Passive House will do this for you without saying explicitly you can't use gas. This is what the PER framework was really well structured to be able to do. And we'll have the PER factors for your specific regions in that, so that it's relevant and you can see exactly how this works and changes in your region. Another upcoming report, which I'm really excited about, this will take a little longer. We have Passive House Network has engaged a really fabulous consulting team. I won't drop the names at the moment yet, but we have embarked on a multi-phase study that will really look at the specific outcomes for Passive House standard compared to the 2021 baseline IECC code, ASHRAE 90.1 current version, and we're looking at it for in all the climate zones. Actually, not all of them. We're skipping Alaska and Hawaii just because we don't quite have the budget to include all of them. Looking at multi-cities across these 7 climate zones, and we're looking at multiple building types. We're starting with multifamily buildings. We're then going to single family, and then we'll close with commercial buildings, and we'll do an extensive comparison on outcomes for the policy community, because they're always asking for this. I've been wanting to have that. I've been looking for this document for a very long time, and we eventually said, okay, well, we just have to get it done and do it ourselves. So lots to look forward to. The Passive House Network's policy committee has been incredibly active in developing all this. This all happens collectively. There's a massive push to and community all working to help develop these things. And so I'm super excited to share what is in the pipeline here at the Passive House Network with regards to pushing for the policies that we want. So with that overview, I am now going to open up the floor for a really interesting discussion. I really wanted to welcome Mike and Shefali back to the table so that we can, and I'm going to stop sharing my slides so we can just have our lovely mug shots on the screen. And really just talk about what we've all shared a little bit more, because I think we've covered the gamut. Mike did a fabulous overview of, where codes are and policies are, state of play, where we are across the nation. And Shefali, you went specifically deep into a particular project because, one thing I wanted to highlight, all three of us are practitioners working in our particular regions and actually implementing codes. We're the boots on the ground and getting this stuff done. And I wanted to, put this out, throw this one out here first. I wanted to ask you the role of the practitioner in policy development. It seems to us as really key. And I wanted to ask if you guys have any advice or insights you can share on what's the most helpful thing that you can, as a practitioner can do for policymakers, and what, in your experience, what advice can you share with others trying to move codes forward in their region? And I think I'll start with Mike and then go to Shefali.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll say, having interacted with policymakers, what I've seen, for at least for our region, I feel that it's true anywhere, is that when practitioners speak and advocate to those who have decisions that make policies, what it does is it provides a needed voice of authority to policymakers. And I find that they respect the opinion of practitioners because we are doing the work. And not just that we're doing the work, but we're also saying from experience, we have what we're advocating for, we have done this. And this is possible. We've demonstrated how do we build to passive house, or how do we provide out of ventilation and how do we become more resilient in our construction? We've designed and built this, so we know it can happen. And then the second thing I just want to touch on, I'd say, would be, for how to do it, how we can be more effective, and that is to learn from each other. I admit, I look at what British Columbia has done, and I look at what New York City has done, and I'm like, what can we take from that and implement here? Because they've had some success in doing little parts and pieces, and how do I make that something that can also be effective here locally?
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that, sure. So I agree that a big part of it is learning from one another. I think the reality is that, what's the saying? We're all sitting on the shoulders of giants that have come before us. And I think that there's so much to be learned. And sometimes people consider it like intellectual property, or if I share this, then they won't hire me to do this thing. And that's really kind of unfortunate, because this is really a critical time, and we really need to work together to push for these things that bring us. We are all ultimately working towards the same common goal. And then in terms of the role practitioners play in helping to inform policy, I think in New York City, and I'm sure this is true in Seattle and San Francisco and other large areas, there's so many layers to this, right? There's building code, there's zoning, there's energy code, there's whatever your funding agency wants to see. And then if you have a lender, they might have their own set of requirements. So I think for us, it's this idea of seeing how this all fits together and seeing where the conflicts are. I think, one of the things that we have been talking about a lot in New York is that they're pushing for more solar. We're pushing for all electrification. They want us to reduce our source EUI. They really are pushing for renewables, but then zoning caps the height of solar arrays on buildings. So it's like, okay, well then I can't do everything. I can't fit everything on the roof. And then you come back and you tell me like, oh no, but not more than 15 feet, but also still have FDNY access path underneath my solar array. Like all of these pieces together, they don't work. So giving that feedback of like, this is how this plays into actual practice when you look at all of these different requirements and how they fit together, to be able to provide that feedback. Like if you can give us 3 more feet, this is all the additional things that we can do, I think is really helpful, because, you know, as well-intentioned as it is, often policy is made in a little bit of a vacuum. It's hard to like understand how all the pieces go together until you're actually doing it.
I think that's a great point, Shefali. I think we definitely saw that in our Policy That Works report, where leveraging the zoning incentives was something that City of Vancouver did really well. And I'm wondering, you know, this is an opportunity that I think a lot of cities are missing, to vertically integrate their zoning with their carbon emissions ambitions and programs. And maybe, Mike, you can, you know, going back to what cities can really do. I don't know if you have any insights into seeing whether cities can really lead on programs and policies in a way that states can then follow, or you know, give me some thoughts on how you see the role of cities driving adoption of passive house and other super high performance outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. I think that I feel that cities, why that's a strong place to go is because that is the testing ground. And locally for me, the city of Seattle, their code is usually, let's say, one code generation ahead of the rest of the state. And they have become, they'll propose something and they test it out. And if it needs to be tweaked, you know, sort of like what is in the current Seattle codes eventually somehow makes it into the future state of Washington across the entire state, those codes. So cities become a testing ground. And so they can push a little further because this local jurisdiction wants to, and they have their climate goals. They can look ahead and they can say, this is what we need to do. And they push forward. And then others can follow behind and say, okay, that what worked or didn't work, but usually all typical cases, it does work. And then I think also that cities are faster to respond. And in the example, and I think some of that has to do, like, you know, like New York City has really pushed forward and has moved forward, and, you know, sort of kind of what was the underlying reasoning behind it. And I feel part of it has to do with the climate crisis that we're in. Shefali, you know better what year it was, but I'm going to say 2011-ish. When Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy came in, and
2012,
really,
yeah.
2012, thank you. And really that sort of climate-related disaster opened a lot of eyes. And New York City said, okay, we need to start looking at resilience and planning for a better future. And that pushed them in a certain direction. And then in our region, you know, for Seattle, the city, and ourselves in Western Washington, you know, we've always had wildfires in the eastern part of the state, but now they're bigger and they're more intense and the wind directions are changing. And now all of a sudden, I mean, prior to 2017, we never thought about wildfire smoke in our cities. And in the last 6 years, 5 of them we've had severe wildfire smoke risks and health risks because of the wildfires. You know, prior to 2020, we didn't think about viruses and air infiltration and the importance of having outdoor air be provided into spaces as much before COVID came along. And then, like, another example of an extreme is, you know, for us in 2021, prior to that, we never thought about extreme heat waves. And then all of a sudden, it was 108 in Seattle, when it's like in 100 years, it was only 100 3 times. So we just had record-shattering heat. And so now we think about heat waves and extreme heat and resilience. And so some of this is reactive, but cities are the ones that can react, I think, a little bit faster, which is why, to your point of what role can they play?
Yeah. Shefali, what about New York City? I think New York has traditionally been a leader in your region. Do you see New York City? What else would you say would you, as a practitioner, want New York City to do?
I will say that a lot of the stuff, as Mike mentioned, that we've put into place is in reaction to something. And it would be a little nicer if we were like just one step ahead. Like, we know some of this stuff is coming. Can we just be a little bit ahead, especially because we're in, generally speaking, an area where all the stakeholders understand the urgency. They may not be willing to pay for it. They may not be willing to they want it to feel like everyone is sacrificing the same amount. So like some voices are louder than others, but that would be a little nice, because I feel like, generally speaking, New York City has this ability to operate outside of the state, outside of the federal government. It's like our own little kingdom where we are like, we set our own rules because we have the amount of people that allow us to do that, which is really nice. And as Mike said, allows us to react. It gives us a little more facility, right? And to be able to react faster. And I had a point that I was going to make, and now I can't recall what it is, but maybe it'll come to me and I will. Okay. Oh, I know what it was. Okay, sorry. I remember. Well, sorry, just 1 second. So one of the things that was really interesting was that in like 2000, like mid 2000s to early 2010s, the housing agency said that your buildings had to meet LEED Gold standards. LEED Silver, it had to meet a LEED standard. And now we really rely on enterprise green communities, the National Affordable Housing Sustainability Guidelines, but they're really stepping back from mandating that one of the stipulations for receiving our assistance is this certification. And it's really unfortunate that in spite of everything that they're doing, that they can't just come out and just say, you have to build passive housing, like a multifamily housing. And it makes so much sense where we are. Capturing that density and making it work in our favor is so simple. There are many firms, many of whom are presenting in this conference, that have done this successfully time and time again at different scales. So it's like, why not just take that extra step? And maybe I'm being naive about it, but if we were able to do it with LEED, I don't know why we can't do it for passive house.
That's a great question, Shefali. But I wanted to go back to something that you also highlighted earlier, was this request, this sort of demand to be proactive rather than reactive. I think we've seen over and over again, that's how a lot of policy does move forward. It's a reaction against a disaster, whether it be a wildfire or a building collapse in structures, or some other pandemic. Wouldn't it be great if policymakers were more proactive? And we've seen, in our research at Passive House Network, the region that we are seeing being the most proactive and developing and delivering incredibly well structured, well thought through integrated policy is actually Massachusetts. And interestingly, the patterns that we're seeing repeating, cities really lead. So they have their opt-in reach code, which a lot of cities and all the bigger cities have already adopted. And it requires, incidentally, Shefali, certified passive house, and is not actually shy about making that explicit, which we're really excited about at Passive House Network, because, if they could do it for LEED, why can't they do it for Passive House? So, other ideas for, we at Passive House Network are saying, yes, we really love what Massachusetts is doing, because they're also already moving their code, their baseline code, to reflect passive house targets. They're not saying passive house, but it's TEDI, thermal energy demand intensity units, that mirror the passive house targets. And elsewhere here at the conference, we'll have a lot of Massachusetts policy folks talk about how they developed that, and they are not shy about saying it was based on Passive House. So lots of exciting things to look forward to. We probably are wrapping at the end here, but I did want to kind of send out one other round of questions, because Mike referenced building performance standards in your presentation. And I wanted to just bring that up. New York has a version of that, which is Local Law 97. So maybe Shefali, you can really talk about the impact of that. But Mike, just going back to you, what's your take on building performance standards? Tell us about how those intersect with Passive House, and whether you're supportive of what those are doing.
I'm hugely supportive of a building performance standard, because it's going to address sort of the large elephant that's been hanging around in the room of the existing building stock. And myself being an architect and doing primarily all new construction, my focus has been on new construction and improving codes for new construction. What this is now doing is we've got an enormous amount of buildings that are out there that have already been built. And that is, I think, the next frontier of codes, as whether they get adopted or not, or we move to Passive House new construction, both the IECC, ASHRAE, our own Washington State Energy Code, we're all kind of converging towards a Passive House new construction plus or minus the year 2030. And it goes back to your earlier comments about, what are the incremental steps that we might have to do to get there, but can we, we're going to have steps that we're going to have to take to get there. For us locally, we're our standard, and Shefali can go into more details about Local Law 97, but ours is, just starting, is going to come into effect, I think, roughly 2026. And it's going to address what it's targeting initially is who are the sort of going to round it into the lower quartile of building performance, of those 20,000 square feet or larger. Those of you that sort of bottom rung, the worst performers of the worst. And it's surprisingly, and I'm impressed that it has caught the attention of building owners, and they are seriously looking at what do we need, and those that are sort of on the cusp, or even that are sort of might be in that middle quartile. They're looking at, okay, I know it's, while it might take effect in that initial quartile, and they don't have what are the full disclosure of what those steps are, but we know between 2026 and 2045 what the end goal is. We just don't know what the steps are in between. So it would be great to know exactly what they are, but they know that at some point this is going to affect my building. And so they're taking a look now, because there's an incentive program that will, if you're an early adopter, there's a little bit of money out there to help you do this now, to get this up and rolling. And so, our state has that performance standard, and that's looking at energy use reductions only. Seattle is coming along and they're going to layer on top of that, doing carbon emission reductions. And I think that's going to get closer to what New York City is doing, in that it's going to start to target moving buildings away from having gas burning emissions and moving over to, for us being very hydro dominant source power, cleaner power, moving faster towards electrification of our existing building stock. So I find that very exciting.
Nice. It's Fowler. Local Law 97.
Yeah, when Local Law 97 was announced in 2019, it was unclear how affordable housing would have to comply with that mandate. And so for a while, there was this weird middle ground where clients were like, well, I don't think we have to really comply with Local Law 97. So should we? And we were like, well, just in case you do, let's do the analysis and let's have this conversation. And so for Vital Brookdale, when we were in design, there was a gas moratorium. The National Grid wanted to build this gas pipeline and they didn't get their permit. So they were saying that there's no more new gas connections. And so it's really funny to think about now, but at the time they were like, oh, let's look at oil. We're going to look at oil? That's crazy. I mean, it's, hindsight and everything, but at the time that was a more reasonable thing than electric. But then when we ran the local law 97 analysis, we're like, oh yeah, this doesn't make any sense. So we'll provide the provisions in case we can't get the gas and there's no way we can make the numbers work. So now next to our very large boiler room, we have this empty room, which we had thought maybe potentially would have an oil tank in there. And so I think that this idea that there are these sort of penalties, and it's really unfortunate that in order, that there has to be this carrot of incentives or a punishment with penalties and fees and all these things in order to get people to do the right thing, which for us, because we are all very like-minded, we're like, why do we need to tell you that there is an emergency and that we need to act now? Buildings last for such a long time. Systems are in place for such a long time. As people who own buildings, how long equipment is used even after end of life, because there isn't the money or there isn't the means, or it's very difficult to replace the equipment. So why not just think about it now and just and provide this sort of infrastructure now? And in the intervening time for Local 97, more information came out in terms of how they were penalizing it. And you can really see that after 2040, that electric carbon emissions rate, or whatever you want, multiplier, reduces significantly under the assumption that, as per the State Climate Act that was passed in 2019, most of our energy will be green. And, we don't sort of go into a deeper discussion of hydro versus solar versus wind or anything like that. The idea is just like, okay, well, everyone is working under the same assumption that all electric is being generated a specific way. And so there is this question of what's happening upstate versus what's happening downstate. But I think that has really given us the opportunity to sort of say we are all working under the assumption that the grid will be clean by 2040. So let's not even waste time to be like, oh, well, all electricity is provided by these coal-powered plants. So why go all electric? What is the point? Isn't gas cleaner from that point of view? And it's no, we're not having that discussion anymore. And I'm so glad to not have to have that discussion anymore, because they're all ultimately red herrings, right? And, just as all these gas bans that are being characterized as the government's telling you how you can cook, it's a red herring. That's not what the government is doing. This is part of a larger discussion, but people sort of really hold on to these talking points and sort of give them outsized importance when really everything needs to be part of this bigger picture. And from that point of view, Local Law 97 and looking at these different targets and what they're set at, and depending on what year it is, gives us that opportunity to have that discussion and sort of take away some of these things that are really muddying the point of why we're doing all of the things that we do and why it's important to continue to do these things and push the envelope, so to speak, pun intended, I guess.
Nice. Yeah, I think, I was also really excited to hear a lot more talk about building energy performance standards, because I think where we saw them aligning with what we uncovered in our research was that it's finally a clear target with a number on it that practitioners can actually aim for, rather than the sort of amorphous, endless hamster wheel of code updates that nobody has really any transparency on where they're eventually going. So I'd love to hear that you guys are also excited about that. That's awesome. So circling back to this gap, or even this perceived gap between passive house and current codes. I'm endlessly fascinated by, how a lot of places tell me, particularly here in California, oh, we don't need passive house because our code is already good. Mike, you probably heard that refrain in your work here in California. The closing the gap between passive house and code, I think, is something that we've really wanted to, push for. And where do you see those gaps in your regions specifically? Because I know here in California, while our building insulation levels are almost passive house and actually passive house in many of our climate regions, the details are all altogether missing. Stuff like thermal bridging, air sealing, the ventilation and detailing, that kind of stuff, the window detailing, and the shading. Exterior shading is still something that is non-existent in California, other than in, older buildings that might have an old awning and just building overhangs, which we all know are inadequate in two of the primary directions. So let's talk about, those gaps between passive house and code, and where you see real need and opportunity to move. So maybe we'll start with Mike again and go back to Shefali.
Yeah, that gap piece, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to include that. Even though these are states that have higher performing codes, and that gap has become very small. I mean, if we can convince a client to, I'll say that, that was one of the reasons why, for myself, I was trying to get something that was passive house close. And the one question, the one that was going to be a giant hurdle was mechanical ventilation. And it was like, we just, having a trickle vent in the window frame was ventilation, and it's like it's not, and so it was so irritating. And I'm just like, I'm going to go for it. Let's write it and see if I can get some people to rally behind me. And we got, so like, now we don't have that conversation of, like Shefali, you mentioned, it's hard to have a conversation with the developer or building owner, where providing mechanical ventilation and balanced heat recovery, if you're not doing it, it's a hard sell. And, now we don't have that conversation here for us in multifamily construction. We still have, you mentioned Bronwyn shading, and that is just still a difficult one. And that was, and Shefali and Bronwyn, were probably surprised, because I like 20 minutes before this presentation, I dropped in the passive survivability slides into my presentation. Because
it's awesome, by the way.
Yeah, because I was like, where can passive house go? And it's like pushing for shading, and that, I feel that helps show what shading, and we aren't successful all the time, but because we have modeling in house, we can do some modeling and say, if you do provide shading, this is what it does for your occupants. If the power goes out, or in being more resilient and providing a comfortable living environment for your occupants. And if it's rental or affordable, you want them to stay. This helps provide something good. And I don't know what the percentage is, but a couple of times we had success, and the owner's like, yeah, this makes sense. Shading is important, but getting over that first cost hurdle of shading, I'm still racking my brain of how code can address shading. But I'll also say that because of the extreme heat events that we've had, for us in 2021, California 2022, too many places to name this summer in 2023, extreme lengthy heat waves. We're starting to see the importance of designing for heat. And
being proactive about it.
And become proactive about it. And how can we start incorporating some? And there's a little tiny piece in codes where if you do shading, you can have a lower solar heat gain coefficient, but that's not driving the change that we currently need. So
it's not enough.
Shading is one.
It's not enough to push people for shading. Yeah.
Right. And in all honesty, that example I showed you, is that if with shading and an envelope, that owner decided to, instead of doing shading on the building, like we are feeling that the code going electrification, we're doing heat pumps, and therefore we got air conditioning. So we're just going to go air conditioning and not do shading. That's what happened on that project. And then it's like, okay, I want to say, okay, well, if you do shading, the energy you need for for cooling with that heat pump will come down because of the same example.
And that's where we need those active incentives from the utilities, because actually it's utilities that benefit from the lower load.
Having that peak demand stay low is really what our grid needs. And I think that's where I'm also excited about. Teddy is looking at heating energy, but I don't know what the acronym is for cooling energy demand for peak energy for cooling, keeping that down. If there was a metric for that might help drive some shading in our
I believe
climates.
It's actually looking at heating and cooling, Mike. It's thermal energy demand intensity, and it's both heating and cooling demand.
Okay, so it's a combined value. Yeah, I didn't know if there was one for.
I mean, they don't combine them together.
And a Teddy equivalent SETI cooling energy demand intensity.
No, it's just hot thermal energy and cool thermal energy as well as warm.
But I don't know. I think that's where we have opportunity to help close the gap, and it's focusing on those in a reactive say, but also to be proactive in that we know the events we're seeing and experiencing are only going to intensify. And so let's plan ahead and be proactive so that we're not reacting when further events happen.
I know we're running out of time, so I'm sorry to cut you off, Mike, but I just want to say that I agree with everything that Mike is saying. And I think the other thing is that for us, there is affordable housing sort of narrows down. You look at code and then you look at, whatever. And it gives you the smaller, narrower band in which you can design that really brings you closer to passive house. But when I look at a code compliant building, the path we have is that, okay, it's all electric, you're operating it. So why don't we design a better building envelope so that it's less for you to operate? Talking to them in a language that clients understand, that speaks to some clients, but unfortunately does not speak to all of them. So definitely mechanical ventilation is a big issue right now. Even with stretch code, we're not getting close to the insulation required on the exterior building envelope, either on a vertical or a horizontal surface, to meet what I would consider a passive house standard. And then I think also this is not really a policy thing, but there's this weird marketing issue, this branding issue that passive house has not gained the traction that LEED and Well has, right? I mean, for a while, I was seeing ads for Well on television with Jennifer Lopez. And I was just, this is really great. But also, I'm so surprised to see this national advertising campaign for this building standard. But we're having a hard time, convincing clients that this could be a marketability tool. And I feel if we've been talking about incentivizing and all of those things, that is kind of a little incentive that helps, because if clients are oh, I can get primo rents. If I say that this is a passive house building, then it's okay, then they're a little more inclined to do it because it's speaking to the bottom line, it's speaking to their priorities. And it's really kind of interesting to me to think of all this LEED chatter and now this Well chatter that passive house is sort of this stepchild that is not getting all of this attention, but is the exemplar that sort of picks up on everything and gives you all of these things without having that, advertising campaign behind it to push it out to everyone.
Interesting. So the Cinderella standard that's being left out of off the ball, the invitation to the ball. I think that's a great, that's a great place to wrap this. I think, I really appreciate your insights, both of you, and your contributions. What I'd like to urge and close with is to let policymakers know that here we have examples of practitioners doing well above and beyond and showing that the industry can do hard things and actually really wants to, and to actually work with us to give us the tools that allow us to have these conversations with our clients and to give just a little bit of extra carrot, the sugar sweeteners to just push these projects over the edge, because I think we've all really demonstrated that this is possible now and that we can do it. So with that, again, I thank you both for your contributions, and I look forward to hearing more and reading more conversation about this in the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
So thank you so much, everybody, for attending this session. And we want to really give you these additional slides to show you that we actually have started to release some of these resources. And the first of them being this graphic, the pathways to the policies we want. This will be available for everybody at the conference. It's part of an extended document with really detailed links to the particular policies that we are supporting at Passive House Network, and really help to give you guys the ammunition that you need to take to your local policy folks and bring this forward. So really appreciate, again, the opportunity to share these. We would be really excited to get feedback from everybody at the conference so that we can really dial in the resources that we're building to serve the needs of our members and the extended Passive House community. So with that, I'm going to close probably a couple of minutes early, go and take a break, stretch, and enjoy the rest of this conference. I'm super excited to see you all here and look forward to seeing you next week in Denver. Thank you so much.